The murder of Tsarina Alexandra. Dynasty's fall. The flickering light of a single oil lamp throws frantic, dancing shadows on the damp basement wall. The air is thick with the smell of damp mortar, dust, and something else, the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. 11 figures stand huddled together in a small, barren room. A woman, her gaze steady, clutches a small velvet cushion. A young man, the heir, sits in a simple chair, his face pale. The others, for young women and a few loyal servants, press close, a silent island of humanity in the cold, half-light. Footsteps echo on the wooden stairs outside. Heavy, purposeful. The door creaks open. A man enters, followed by a squad of others. He holds a piece of paper. His voice is flat, devoid of emotion as he reads the sentence. The words are a formality. The sentence was passed the moment they were brought to this house. The woman, the Tsarina, draws a sharp breath. She makes the sign of the cross. Her daughters do the same. Then, the world explodes. The roar of revolvers is deafening in the confined space, a brutal, chaotic symphony. The room fills with acrid smoke, stinging the eyes, choking the lungs. The first shots are messy, frantic. Men are shouting. The initial volley is not enough. Jewels sewn into the women's corsets act as a crude, unintended armor, deflecting bullets. The shooters, their faces grim and sweating, step closer. The sound changes from sharp cracks to heavier, more final thuds as bayonets are employed. The shadows on the wall writhe and jerk in a grotesque pantomime of the slaughter. It is not a clean execution. It is a butchering, a frenzy of blood and noise that seems to last an eternity. When the shooting stops, the silence that follows is more terrifying than the gunfire. It is the silence of a dynasty, extinguished. 4 years earlier, the world was a different place. The Alexander Palace at Tsarsco Selo was a universe of gilt and marble. The air smelled of polished parquet, French perfume, and the faint, ever-present scent of hyacinths from the hothouses. Here, Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, ruled over a court that both revered and resented her. She was a woman of intense faith and iron will, her face often set in her expression of stern piety that many mistook for coldness. Her love for her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, was absolute. Theirs was one of the great love stories of royalty, but it was a love that turned inward, shutting out the world, and in doing so, sealed their fate. The problem was the heir, the boy, Alexei, the hope of Russia. From his first days, it was clear he carried the royal disease, hemophilia, passed down from his great-grandmother, Victoria. A simple bruise could mean days of agony. A minor fall could be a death sentence. The court physicians were powerless. Their potions and poultices were useless against the invisible bleeding within the boy's joints. His cries of pain echoed through the palace's lavish halls, a constant, terrifying reminder of the dynasty's fragility. In her desperation, the Tsarina turned away from the established church and the medical men. She turned to God, and to the man she believed was God's messenger. His name was Grigory Rasputin. He arrived from the Siberian wilderness, a Stayets, a holy man, with piercing grey eyes, a coarse beard, and a reputation for strange powers. He smelled of cheap wine and unwashed flesh, a stark contrast to the palace's opulence. Yet, when he prayed over Alexei, the bleeding would stop. The pain would subside. To Alexandra, it was a miracle. Rasputin was their savior. To the Russian aristocracy and the people of St. Petersburg, he was a grotesque scandal. Whispers slithered through the salons and taverns like poison. They called him the Mad Monk. They spoke of his drunken orgies, his influence over state appointments, his hold over the Tsarina. Pamphlets and cartoons depicted him in the Tsar's bed, with Alexandra a willing participant in his debaucheries. The smell of suspicion began to cling to the Romanovs, far more potent than the scent of hyacinths. The Tsar, a man who preferred the simplicity of family life to the complexities of rule, was seen as weak, dominated by his wife and her sinister pet mystic. The foundation of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was cracking. Then came the war. The Great War. The patriotic fervor that swept Russia in 1914 initially united the people behind their Tsar. Nicholas left for the front to take personal command of the army. It was a catastrophic decision. He was now directly associated with every defeat, every mile of territory lost, every life wasted in the frozen trenches. Back in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was now called, Alexandra was left as regent. And by her side was Rasputin. His influence seemed to know no bounds. He advised on military strategy. He appointed and dismissed ministers based on his whims or their loyalty to him. The government became a revolving door of incompetence and corruption, all orchestrated, it seemed, by the unwashed peasant from Siberia. The air in the capital grew thick with rage and paranoia. The aristocracy had had enough. In December 1916, a group of nobles, including a member of the royal family, Prince Felix Yusupov, lured Rasputin to a palace basement. They fed him cyanide-laced cakes and wine. The poison had no effect. In a panic, Yusupov shot him. Rasputin fell, then rose again, stumbling into the courtyard. The conspirators shot him again, beat him, and finally, bound him and threw his body through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When his body was found days later, the autopsy revealed a chilling fact: there was water in his lungs. Grigory Rasputin had still been alive when he was thrown into the freezing river. His murder was not the cure the plotters had hoped for. It was the final act that severed the last threads of legitimacy. It proved that the ruling class was rotten, capable of the same barbarism they accused Rasputin of. The murder did not save the Romanovs. It sealed their doom. The bitter winter of 1917 was not just a season, it was a state of being. The war ground on, a distant, grinding beast consuming men and hope in equal measure. In Petrograd, the bread line stretched for blocks, a river of shivering, hollow-eyed humanity. The air was sharp with wood smoke and discontent. The people were starving, freezing, and tired of a war that seemed to benefit no one but the Kaiser. The murder of Rasputin had not restored the Tsar's authority. It had merely proven that violence was a language everyone could understand. The spark came in March. A bread riot, a common enough occurrence, spiraled into a general strike. Factory workers, their breath pluming in the frigid air, poured into the streets. They were joined by soldiers of the garrison, the very men tasked with keeping order. But their loyalty, like the thin ice on the Neva, had cracked. They looked at the hungry faces of the crowds and saw their own mothers, their own sisters. They turned their rifles, not on the people, but on their officers. The city descended into anarchy. The sound of gunfire and shattering glass was the new music of the capital. Inside the Alexander Palace, isolated from the chaos, Alexandra received the telegrams with a growing sense of disbelief. She called the protests a hooligan movement, convinced the people would soon come to their senses and rally around their Tsar. But the people were not rallying. They were storming the prisons, burning police stations, and occupying the Duma. The machine of state was breaking down, its gears jammed with frost and fury. Nicholas, at military headquarters, tried to return to his family. His imperial train was halted by rebellious troops. The Tsar of all the Russias was a prisoner of his own army. There was no grand battle, no final stand. The end of the Romanov autocracy was a quiet, bureaucratic affair. In a stuffy railway car, surrounded by grim-faced generals and politicians, Nicholas II was presented with the inevitable. He must abdicate. He sat at a small table, the document before him. He signed it first for himself, then, in a heartbreaking moment of futile hope, for his son, Alexei. The burden of the bleeding disease was too great for a boy to bear an empire. He named his brother, Grand Duke Michael, as his successor. Michael, sensing the revolutionary tide, refused the crown. In a few strokes of a pen, 3 centuries of Romanov rule were over. The power now resided with a shaky provisional government. For Alexandra and her family, the world shrank to the confines of their palace. The hyacinth still bloomed, but the air was now thick with the smell of fear and confinement. The imperial guards, once so proud and loyal, were replaced. The new sentries were sullen, their uniforms unkempt. They smoked in the hallways, their eyes filled with a new, dangerous contempt. They were no longer protectors, they were jailers. The family was now the former ones. Their lives became a monotonous routine of meals, walks in the guarded garden, and Bible readings. They were living in a gilded cage, waiting for a rescue that seemed less likely with every passing day. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was a moderate body. They intended to put Nicholas on trial for his crimes against the people, a public reckoning for the old regime. But they were not murderers. For a few months, there was a fragile safety. Kerensky even moved the family away from the volatile capital, to the governor's mansion in the Siberian town of Tobolsk. It was a journey into exile, a slow, mournful train ride east, watched by silent, hostile crowds at every station. The Russia they had once ruled now stared at them with cold, unfamiliar eyes. But the political winds were shifting again. The provisional government was weak, vacillating on the war and unable to solve the crippling food shortages. And in the shadows, a more radical, more ruthless force was gathering strength. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised not reform, but revolution. Peace, land, and bread. It was a simple, powerful message that resonated with the desperate. In November of 1917, they struck. The Bolshevik Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace. The provisional government fell. Kerensky fled. A new, hard regime was born, and it had no use for a living Tsar. The Romanovs' fate was now in the hands of men who saw them not as fallen monarchs, but as a dangerous symbol, a rallying point for their enemies, who were already gathering into a white army to fight the new red regime. In the spring of 1918, the order came from Moscow. The family was to be moved once more. They were told it was for their own safety. Alexandra, her health failing, had to be carried to the train by a guard. Her daughters sewed their remaining jewels into their corsets and dresses, a secret treasury for the uncertain future. They did not know their destination was a small, drab merchant's house in the Ural mountain city of Ekaterinburg, a house with a sinister, fitting name, the House of Special Purpose. The train journey to Ekaterinburg was a descent into a deeper circle of hell. The comfortable carriages of Tobolsk were a distant memory. Now, they were packed into a common third-class compartment, the air thick with the smell of sweat, cheap tobacco, and the unwashed bodies of their new guards. These were not the sullen soldiers of Tsarskoye Selo. These were hardened Bolsheviks, men whose hatred for the bloodsuckers and bourgeois parasites was a core part of their identity. They jeered. They made crude jokes about the Grand Duchesses. They stole small personal items from the family's luggage just for the pleasure of seeing their discomfort. Ekaterinburg was a red stronghold, a city of factories and militant workers, fiercely loyal to the new Soviet state. The Ipatiev house stood on a hill, a two-story brick building that should have been an unremarkable home for a successful merchant. Now, it was a prison. Its windows were painted white, sealing the inhabitants off from the outside world. A tall, rough wooden fence was erected around the perimeter, topped with barbed wire. Locals called it the House of Special Purpose. The name was a chilling piece of Bolshevik bureaucracy, a euphemism that hid a terrible truth. Life inside was a study in claustrophobic humiliation. The family was confined to a few rooms on the second floor. The once glorious Tsarina, who had presided over the most glittering court in Europe, now spent her days in a shabby armchair, her face a mask of grief and illness. Nicholas, ever the stoic, sawed firewood in the small, muddy courtyard, a pathetic parody of the simple country life he had always craved. The children, their vitality slowly draining away, read books to each other and played quiet games of bezique. The guards watched their every move. They scribbled obscene drawings on the wallpaper, depicting the Tsarina with Rasputin. They refused to let the doors to the toilet be closed, stripping the family of their last shreds of privacy. The air in the house was a foul mixture of boiled cabbage, unemptied chamber pots, the ever-present scent of gun oil, and the sour breath of their captors. The sounds were the tramp of heavy boots on the stairs, the clatter of rifles being cleaned, the low, guttural laughter of the guards just outside the door. Every day, the world outside grew more dangerous. The White Army was advancing, its forces drawing closer to Ekaterinburg with each passing week. The crack of rifle fire from the outskirts of the city was a constant, ominous drumbeat. For the Bolsheviks holding the Romanovs, the living banner of the counter-revolution was becoming an untenable liability. In Moscow, the decision was being weighed. The Soviet leadership was divided. Some argued for a public trial, a grand spectacle to condemn the old regime. But the military situation was too precarious. A trial was a risk. The Whites could storm the city and free the Tsar before a verdict was read. The telegraph lines between Moscow and Ekaterinburg hummed with coded messages. The local Ural Soviet, a body of fervent revolutionaries, was pushing for a more permanent, more final solution. They had not fought a revolution to see it undone by a rescue. The pressure mounted. The noose was tightening. On the night of July 16, 1918, the commandant of the house, a man named Yakov Yurovsky, received the direct order. The time for debate was over. The sentence had been passed. He assembled an execution squad of 11 men, a mix of Russians and Latvian riflemen, ensuring no single nationality would bear the sole blame. He told them the order came from the highest level, that it was a necessary act for the revolution. There were no objections. That night, the family went to bed as usual, the oppressive summer heat doing little to dispel the chill of their confinement. They were woken just after midnight. Yurovsky came to their door. His voice was calm, authoritative. He told them there was unrest in the city, that they must be moved for their safety. They had to gather in the basement. There was no panic. This had happened before. They dressed quietly. The Tsar, carrying his son Alexei in his arms, led the way. Alexandra followed, her face set in its familiar expression of weary resolve. Behind them came the 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their loyal servants, Dr. Botkin, the maid Anna Demidova, the cook Karatanov, and the footman Trupp. They were led down the narrow, wooden staircase, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence of the house. The guards watched them pass, their faces unreadable. They were ushered into a small, semi-basement room, barely 11 by 13 feet. Its walls were covered with a cheap, striped wallpaper. A single, barred window looked out onto the base of the wooden fence. The room was empty save for a few plain chairs. Alexandra, her legs swollen and painful, asked for a chair. 2 were brought in. She sat in one. Nicholas, still holding Alexei, sat in the other. The daughters stood behind their mother. The servants stood against the back wall. They waited. The air was still and heavy. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Yakov Yurovsky entered, followed by his entire squad. The small room was now packed, the air growing thick with the smell of nervous sweat and the presence of armed men. Nicholas started to rise, a question on his lips. What? Yurovsky stepped forward. He held a small piece of paper. He did not meet the Tsar's eyes. His voice was flat, reciting the words he had memorized. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to sentence you to death. The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Nicholas' face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. What? He said again, his voice barely a whisper. Then, the world dissolved into noise and fire. The roar was absolute. A concussive wave of sound that left no room for thought, only primal terror. The shooters, their hands slick with sweat, fired directly into the huddled group at point-blank range. The room, small to begin with, became a slaughterhouse. The first to fall was Tsar Nicholas, a bullet to the head. He slumped to the floor, his question forever unanswered. Alexandra had just enough time to raise her hand, to make the sign of the cross one final time, before a bullet found her heart. She died in her chair, as if in state. But the killing was not clean. It was a frantic, chaotic, and messy business. The air filled with the thick, coppery smell of blood and the choking haze of cordite. The daughters, in their simple dresses, screamed. The bullets meant for them ricocheted, whining off the walls. The jewels sewn into their corsets, their mother's desperate plan for a future, had become a cruel, unintended armor, deflecting the slugs and turning them into deadly, tumbling projectives that tore through their bodies without delivering a quick death. The scene descended into hellish confusion. Men shouted over the gunfire. The initial volley had not been enough. The shooters, their eyes wide with a mixture of revolutionary fervor and sheer panic, stepped forward into the swirling smoke. They fired again, into the twitching bodies on the floor. Still, some of the figures moved. A low moan, a shuddering breath. The maid, Anna Demidova, terrified but fiercely loyal, rushed towards the Tsarina with the small velvet cushion she clutched, as if it could somehow shield her mistress. A bayonet met her halfway. The sound in the room changed. The sharp, definitive cracks of the revolvers were replaced by the wet, grunting thuds of bayonet thrusts. The killers used their rifle butts, their boots, the long, cold steel of their blades. They stabbed and bludgeoned anything that still showed a flicker of life. The striped wallpaper was no longer just striped. It was spattered with a dark, dripping abstract art. The floor grew slick, a shallow, sticky pool of crimson spreading from the center of the room. When the last movement ceased, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. It was broken only by the ragged, panting breaths of the executioners. They stood amidst the carnage, their uniforms splattered, their faces smeared with sweat and blood. The heat in the room was stifling, the stench of death already beginning to bloom. 11 bodies lay in a tangled, bloody heap. The Romanov Dynasty was gone. But the work was not yet finished. Yurovsky, a man of chilling efficiency, barked orders. The bodies had to be disposed of. Permanently. This was not just an execution. It was an erasure. They were wrapped in sheets taken from the family's own beds and loaded onto a waiting truck. The truck, a Fiat, struggled through the dark, wooded roads north of the city, its headlights cutting weak beams through the pre-dawn gloom. The destination was a remote area known as the Four Brothers, a patch of forest marked by 4 tall pine trees. Dawn was breaking as they arrived at an abandoned mine shaft. The plan to dump the bodies into the shaft and collapse it with grenades began to unravel. The well was too shallow. Discovery was too likely. As the men labored, stripping the bodies to search for any remaining valuables, the sheer brutality of their task became apparent. To make the bodies unrecognizable and easier to sink, they used sulfuric acid and gasoline. They lit them on fire. The acrid smoke curled into the morning sky, a foul incense to a new, pitiless age. The fire, however, refused to consume 2 of the bodies. In a final, grisly act of desperation, they buried what remained in a shallow grave under the cart track itself, believing the constant passage of carts would obscure the site forever. Back in Ekaterinburg, the Ural Soviet announced that the Tsar had been shot due to the approach of the White Armies, but that his family had been evacuated to a safe place. The lie was thin, but it held for a time. The world was still reeling from the war. The Bolsheviks consolidated their power, and the bloody Russian Civil War raged for another 5 years, drowning the memory of the Ipatiev house murders in an ocean of further violence. The House of Special Purpose was eventually torn down on the orders of a later Soviet leader, Boris Yeltsin, who feared it would become a monarchist shrine. But the Earth, it seemed, was unwilling to keep its secret forever. For decades, amateur sleuths and historians, drawn by the grim mystery, searched the forests around Ekaterinburg. Then, in 1979, a team of amateur archaeologists found a grave. It contained the bones of 9 people. The Romanovs, it seemed, had been found. But the story was not over. 2 bodies were missing. Those of Alexei, the heir, and one of his sisters, most likely Maria or Anastasia. The mystery of their final fate and the gruesome details of that night were only beginning to be unearthed. The grave under the cart track kept its grisly secret for over 60 years. The forest grew thick over the site, the pine needles and birch leaves layering over the violence. But whispers persisted. The official Soviet narrative was a brittle thing, full of holes and contradictions. The Tsar was executed, The family was safe. No one truly believed it. The story festered in the collective memory, a dark, unresolved chord. Then, in 1979, two amateur historians, a filmmaker and a geologist, acting on a tip from a long-dead participant's memoir, crept into the Koptiaki forest under the cover of darkness. They worked with a frantic, nervous energy, their shovels biting into the cold, damp earth. The smell of pine and wet loam filled the air. And then, a shovel struck something that was not a root. Bone. They had found it. The Romanovs. But this was still the Soviet Union. To reveal this find was to risk everything. Terrified, they reburied the bones, swearing to each other to keep the secret until the time was right. That time came with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. In 1991, as the hammer and sickle was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, the grave was officially exhumed. The world watched as forensic scientists, including an international team, began the macabre task of identification. The skeletons were a jumbled, chaotic mess, bearing the clear marks of violence, bullet wounds, bayonet gouges. The acid had done its work, eating away at the bone. But science could now speak for the dead. They used dental records, cranial reconstruction, and a new, powerful tool, DNA analysis. They tracked down a living relative, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, whose grandmother was Tsarina Alexandra's sister. The mitochondrial DNA, passed unchanged from mother to child, was a perfect match for Alexandra and her daughters. The bones of Nicholas II were confirmed with a 98.5% probability. The Romanovs had been found. But the story was not over. The grave contained only 9 skeletons. 2 were missing: Alexei, the heir, and one of the younger sisters, Maria or Anastasia. This single, glaring absence reignited a century of speculation. Where were the missing bodies? The mystery gave new life to an old, seductive fairy tale, the legend of Anastasia. For decades, women across Europe and America had claimed to be the youngest Grand Duchess, having miraculously survived the slaughter. The most famous, Anna Anderson, had captivated the world with her story, her piercing eyes and knowledge of court life convincing many. She fought her claim in courts for years. But DNA, the ultimate arbiter of truth, finally laid the fantasy to rest. Anna Anderson's DNA did not match the Romanov remains. She was an imposter, a Polish factory worker with a troubled mind. There would be no fairy tale escape. The hunt for the last 2 bodies intensified. The search returned to the forests of the 4 brothers, guided by Yurovsky's chilling, matter-of-fact note that was found in the Soviet archives after the fall of communism. In 2007, a small group of amateur archaeologists, working in a boggy area just 70 meters from the first grave, found a second pit. Inside were a collection of bone fragments, teeth, and bullets. The remains were scant, charred, and shattered. But they were enough. DNA tests confirmed they belonged to Alexei and, most likely, his sister Maria. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The full, horrifying picture was now clear. There had been no survivors. The entire family had perished in that basement room. The Bolsheviks, in their frantic attempt to hide the evidence, had separated the 2 bodies and tried to burn them completely in a separate pyre, their remains tossed into this second, shallower pit. In death, the Romanovs finally found a measure of peace they were denied in life. In 1998, the remains of the first 9 were interred with great ceremony in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian Tsars. The last 2 were buried there in 2015. The Russian Orthodox Church, after years of investigation and debate, canonized them all as passion bearers, martyrs who met their deaths with Christian humility. Yet, even in their sainthood, debate persists. A faction within the church, and some historians, question the absolute certainty of the identifications. Conspiracy theories, like stubborn weeds, continue to sprout. But the scientific evidence is overwhelming. The true, enduring mystery is not one of survival, but of the act itself. Was it a necessary, if brutal, political act to extinguish the symbol of the old regime and secure the revolution? Or was it a cold-blooded massacre, a crime that stained the new Soviet state with the blood of innocent children from its very inception? The Ipatiev house is gone, replaced by a magnificent cathedral, the Church on the Blood. Pilgrims now stand on the spot where the basement room once was, their heads bowed in prayer. The air smells of incense and candle wax, a fragrant veil over the memory of gunpowder and blood. The story of the Romanovs is no longer a political secret but a human tragedy, a stark reminder of how swiftly a world can shatter, and how the echoes of a single violent night in a small white-walled room can reverberate for a century. The end of their story was written not in palaces, but in a shallow, muddy grave in a Siberian forest, a truth more unsettling than any legend. The grand cathedral now stands where the Ipatiev house once squatted, its onion domes a defiant act of sanctification. Inside, the air is heavy with beeswax and myrrh. Pilgrims press their lips to the cool marble, their whispers a prayerful murmur. They light candles, their flames a tiny, flickering defiance of the darkness that once consumed this place. But descend to the lower church, to the recreated cellar, and the atmosphere chills. This is the exact spot. The striped wallpaper is a replica. The single, barred window looks out onto nothing. Standing here, it is impossible not to feel the ghost of that moment, the deafening roar, the desperate, final prayers. The sanctity above feels like a fragile layer over a wound that has never truly healed. The scientific reckoning, while conclusive, has not brought universal closure. In laboratories, the bones continue their testimony. Experts point to the minute striations on the bullets, matching them to the specific revolvers. They trace the arc of a bayonet thrust on a scapula. The skeletons of the young women show the telltale patterns of deflected bullets, the jewels in their corsets creating a bizarre, posthumous map of their final moments. The evidence is irrefutable, a cold narrative written in calcium and lead. Yet, a sliver of theological doubt persisted for years, particularly within the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. The initial DNA evidence, the political pressures of a new Russia, it fueled quiet skepticism. Were these truly the remains of the royal martyrs? The discovery of Alexei and Maria's bones in 2007, and their subsequent confirmation, silenced most official doubt. But for the most devout, faith sometimes demands a certainty that science, with its probabilities, can never fully provide. The historical and moral debate, however, endures. Historians pore over the telegrams between Moscow and Ekaterinburg. Was the order to kill the entire family given directly by Lenin? Or was it a panicked decision by the local Ural Soviet, terrified of the Romanovs becoming a rallying point for the advancing whites? The paper trail is deliberately obscure. The Bolshevik leadership could maintain plausible deniability, while their subordinates carried out the grim task. Apologists for the revolution, though few defend the murder of children, argue the context, the millions dead in the war, the centuries of oppression. The Romanovs, in this view, were the living embodiment of a system drenched in blood. Their execution was the brutal, logical conclusion of a class war that admitted no prisoners. But this cold political calculus shatters against the intimate reality. This was not a battle. It was a secret, messy slaughter in a cramped basement. The killers did not just shoot the Tsar, they bayoneted screaming young women and a 13-year-old boy. The event transcends politics and enters the realm of a primal, almost mythic evil. The legacy of that night is a stain that never faded. It established a precedent of absolute ruthlessness that would define the Soviet state for decades. The secret police, the show trials, the gulag, all were foreshadowed in that basement. The revolution began to devour its own, starting with the symbols of the old world it sought to destroy. Today, the story of Tsarina Alexandra and her family endures not because of the crown she wore, but because of the humanity she shared. Her love for a sick son, her devotion to her husband, her fierce, flawed protectiveness, these are universal themes. Theirs is a Greek tragedy played out on a modern stage. The candles in the church on the blood will continue to burn. The scientific reports will sit in their archives. The historians will continue to debate. But the final, unsettling truth remains. In that room, they did not just kill a family, They murdered a world. The end.